We're here to talk about supply chain cybersecurity. In fact, the title of this podcast is Don't Be the Weakest Link, a deep dive into supply chain security. So we better start by introducing ourselves. Why don't you go first?
So I'm Gerry, I'm the head of cybersecurity practice. So my background was originally in financial risk before moving into information security. I've been with Evalian for about 3 years now, took over the team last September.
I'm Huggett. I am one of the directors at Evalian. I founded the business just over 6.5 years ago. I also work as a security consultant. I work very closely with Matt. I spend a lot of my time working with large organisations, helping them make sense of security risk management, and with a particular focus, much like Matt in recent years, on supplier risk management. Every organisation has got a supply chain upon which they rely either for the provision of their own services or in order to provide services to their organisation to help them meet their core business needs. And it's increasingly the case, I think, that whereas supply chain security, as one of our colleagues once said, was the elephant outside the room, it's something more of an elephant inside the room now, and organisations are struggling to make sense of what does it mean, how they can implement it. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is what do we mean by supply chain cybersecurity, and what steps should organisations take to implement a supply chain or supply chain security risk management program. Matt, let's start with a key question here. What do we mean by supply chain cybersecurity?
Organisations are processing vast amount of data. So, and a lot of that is leaving your organisational boundary.
Why is it leaving your organisation?
Well, because you have a complex supply chain, which and you rely on a lot of suppliers to deliver services for you.
Give me some examples, Matt.
So, a good example would be your cloud service provider. Most people now use some form of cloud infrastructure, be it.
And that's now part of your supply chain,
and
because maybe 20 years ago you'd have bought the software,
exactly.
You'd have owned the software, you'd install it, but now someone's providing it to you as a service.
Yes, exactly. So, why would you want as a business to spend lots of money on stuff that isn't your core service, that isn't making you money, when you could outsource that expertise to an organisation that have the infrastructure to handle that every day, whereas you're just doing that one sunk cost. It makes total sense to move something from a capital expenditure to an operating expenditure and farm it out, right?
That's a simple example.
Yeah.
We've all got SaaS services and we need to think about the security within those software as a service, cloud service providers. But what if we're outsourcing, say we're in hospitality and we outsource ticketing or we outsource delivery of some key aspect of our business? Is that part of my supply chain as well?
Absolutely. If you are relying on a third party to deliver a service, to deliver the service that you are providing to your customers or your clients.
And what way is that a risk to my organisation from a cybersecurity perspective? Because I've got my organisation, and I can put a wall around it, and I can have routes in and out, and I can provide the information that they need to them. But why is it a risk to my organisation if I've outsourced elements of my business to them?
From a cybersecurity perspective, it all stems down from the business is purpose, right? You're there. Your business exists to deliver a product or deliver a service. If you can no longer deliver that product or service because someone in your supply chain fails, then that's a significant risk. It's a cybersecurity risk because organisations, your organisation will have cybersecurity risks in the same way that your supplier has cybersecurity risks.
But that's an interesting point, though. So if that business fails, so this is, and it's a term that we use a lot in the industry. This is about cyber and business resilience, or even, as Dora would say, operational resilience.
Yeah.
Because if they can't provide their service, you might not be able to provide your service. There might be something missing.
Absolutely.
But also, I guess, if they suffer a breach, the data they hold or the access they've got might be our data.
In order for them to facilitate their services, they might need to collect your data. You might need to send them your data. That data may include information, personal information about your customers, your client. You're very likely sending out very high-risk data from a regulatory perspective under GDPR to one or more members of your supply chain or sub-processors.
All right, so thinking back to GDPR then, back in 2018, when we were thinking about, who are our data processors and what do they do? How have they secured our data? Lots of data processing agreements going out, lots of conversations around what's the level of security you apply to personal data. So data security is one part of it, not just personal data. What about those suppliers, though, that are integrated with our systems or even have got access to our system? Where's the risk there? What's the concern?
Well, I mean, so the risk there is that they've got access to your system, right? So in the same way you would want to control access to your systems internally, you want to make sure that that supplier is accessing your system securely, right? So the risk is that if their user is compromised, they aren't practicing good security hygiene, then the knock-on effect is that those credentials, that access into your environment is compromised, and then your environment is compromised. You know, an organisation could be very confident in their own security controls, right? And maybe that's correct, but then the attacker will see that and look, right, okay, what are alternative ways into your system? And one of those ways might be through your supply chain.
What is it that's making organisations think, well, we need to do something about supply chain security or third-party risk management?
I mean, there's a few things. I mean, one is looking at other organisations in their sector that get hit through an attack that comes through their supply chain. Another is through regulatory pressure. So you have NIS1 back in 2018. Obviously, GDPR put pressure on identifying where your personal data sat within your processes, sub-processes. NIS1, going back, put emphasis on securing the supply chain of operations of essential services. NIS2 has recently come out, which expanded the scope of NIS1. So more organisations are being brought into that sort of regulatory pressure. And then you have other regulations coming around DORA.
And you think that there's pressure also from other interested parties like insurers?
Well, absolutely. So, it's not just regulatory pressure. Insurers are increasingly looking at supply chain as a significant cybersecurity risk. So if you want, possibly even to get cyber insurance, having a robust security supply chain risk management process or framework in place is a requirement for most insurers now.
It's interesting that, isn't it? Because we're working with a client at the moment who is bidding for a large contract with a public sector government organisation, and they're looking to flow down a substantial number of security conditions. And actually, one of the things that came up was they also wanted a major indemnity and unlimited liability indemnity, didn't they?
So there's pressures from all sides, effectively. You've got pressure from your potential clients to validate your cybersecurity controls. Those clients are increasingly wanting their requirements pushed through your supply chain. So you will be talking to your suppliers about their supply chain security or their internal security, and then they in turn should be talking to their suppliers, etc. So as you can see, more and more organisations being brought into that pressure.
What's the current state of supply chain risk management in your experience? Where are we at as an industry around knowing our suppliers and understanding the security risks within the supply chain?
Yeah, I think it's probably still in its infancy. With most organisations, it's a difficult thing to get right. It's implementing a technical control or getting a new SOC or a SIEM solution in place is more tangible than looking at the complexities of trying to establish a relationship with the suppliers and then defining what security requirements that you'd want to flow down through. It's a complex process.
And what are some of the barriers? What are reasons? We talked about it's hard, it's complex, you've said, but what are some of the reasons why organisations maybe struggle with it?
Plenty. Similarly to a lot of security issues within organisations, it comes down to time and resource of the teams involved with this. Most organisations need to be slim. The people who tend to where supply chain security sits tend to be smaller teams, might not have the time or the expertise to put in place an appropriate level of security. There's also the cost and there's various aspects.
So probably the same what you're saying, and the same challenges that any security function, if there is a dedicated security function within an organisation, faces. The first thing is maybe expertise.
Exactly.
They probably even if they've got expertise, they might be short of time and resource. And I assume it's much wider than just a security problem. I'm assuming that when we're talking supply chain, there's other functions within the business.
Absolutely. So not only is it complex, you need to, and I think what I was trying to allude to earlier around sort of time and resources, and implementing controls from let's say almost an IT perspective. That's relatively easy because you control that domain within the business, or the person who tends to be responsible for cybersecurity will have more impact on that area of the business. to get supplier security right, you need to engage with the likes of procurement, the likes of legal, the likes of compliance.
One of the questions that we might get asked then is, does it really matter if an organisation's not suffered a supply chain security incident? Why would they suddenly need to start thinking about risk? Do we have examples of real world breaches or outages that have occurred as a result of a security failure in the supply chain?
It can be very difficult if something hasn't happened to an organisation to get buy-in and convinced that actually this is a priority and should be looked at, because there are lots of other conflicting priorities, and that's understandable. I think a very good way of putting this into context is to look at real-world examples. A great example is CrowdStrike. To answer that one, there was a failure of a process which impacted one of their suppliers, Microsoft, which then impacted a broad range, a massive range of organisations around the world, and caused, they're probably still counting the damage. And, probably for a lot of those organisations, that was the first time they've had an incident.
But that wasn't a security breach that they themselves suffered.
It was a failure of controls within CrowdStrike,
which led to an
availability outage, which then impacted, because of the ubiquity of ubiquity of certain organisations in loads of organisations' supply chain, and had that knock-on effect on organisations in who were clients of airports, hospitals, etc., etc.
What about examples though where someone's supply chain has actively been the subject of a targeted?
And SolarWinds springs to mind. I believe that was there's a good example of a state-sponsored group compromising a tool a piece of software that was used by a broad range of clients. Kaseya is another good example. So they had an attack on their infrastructure as a ransomware attack, and that impacted, had that knock-on effect, impacted around 50 MSPs and another 50, probably 500-600 more of their clients.
And I suppose the thing that's interesting about SolarWinds and Kaseya is that the threat actor was targeting them, but they weren't then subsequently trying to get access to one of the organisations they supply. They were able to pivot into multiple organisations.
Exactly, and again, this comes back to that. If you look at your supply chain, you'll find names that not only you're using, but the organisation next to you is using, the one next to you is using. Some of these organisations, Microsoft, Google, etc., are ubiquitous across most organisations' supply chain. So if you think of an attack that successfully compromised one of those, you're looking at a massive knock-on effect.
Okay, so we know what supply chain security risk management is and means. We also understand now why it's increasingly important to organisations. We recognise that organisations are starting to talk about it, but might not understand how to handle it. So if we were working with a client, what would we be recommending to them? What's the starting point for implementing a supply chain security risk management program?
What I'd say to any organisation is to understand what's there. You can't protect what you don't know. So figure out who are your suppliers. It's actually quite complicated. So, I don't think I've ever walked into an organisation where I've had a straight answer to who are your suppliers. And, that's completely understandable because businesses have different arms, they have different functions, and each function may have their own suppliers delivering a particular service. If you think about your finance team, they may have their finance software, which has no bearing on, the procurement function, or the marketing team will have there are Adobe subscriptions and things like that. So when you look at an organisation, especially complex organisations, and the ones that the ones we work with, that's not an easy answer.
Okay, so step one, identify your suppliers. Then what?
Yeah, then figure out what they do for you. A good example is when an organisation we work with in power generation, you might have one supplier, but they may be delivering. They may be bringing a discard system, but they also might be manufacturing wind turbines, or they might be delivering sensors to go into a boiler. But that's one supplier. But within that supplier, they'll have different arms and they'll have different risks.
Okay, so some parts might be providing you with product.
Yep.
Other parts might be providing you with service. Yep. Other parts might be doing both.
Might be doing both, or it could be a SaaS platform, or it could be infrastructure.
I know who my suppliers are.
Yep.
And I know what they do for me. Where do I go from there?
Then you need to understand how critical is what they do for me. Fundamentally, you want to understand which suppliers do I rely on to deliver my core businesses. If I want to achieve my objectives as a business, if I want to sell more product, deliver products, get great customer feedback, grow my customer base, grow my client base, which of my suppliers are most critical?
Right, so I know who they are, I know what they do. I'm going to categorise them by importance.
Exactly. So
and how do I do that? Is it about impact?
So a good place to start is impact, right?
So impact, if they suffer a breach or they can't provide their service to me.
Yeah, so you want to factor in a number of things here, right? You want to understand, right, okay, if they fall over and they stop being, and the availability of their service ceases to exist for me, can I continue to deliver my services, or can I fail over to another supplier?
Right, so that's them affecting my business.
That's them,
my operational readiness.
Exactly. And the flip side to that is, do by dint of what they do for you, either process your data. It could be personal data, it could be special category data, or it could just be very sensitive business data that's embarrassing. Or do they have direct access to our systems? And by that I mean, if they were compromised, would it be possible for that attacker to then gain access to my information, which would be damaging to me personally, or gain access to my environment, in which case that's also a massive risk for me.
Okay, makes sense. So I know who my suppliers are, I know what they do for me,
yep.
And I've identified them, or I've categorised them based on their importance or impact. So I know not all suppliers are equal. What do I do now?
So this is where it gets a bit more complicated. Not to say that first phase was easy, but the next step is, what do you do with that information? You know the ones that are most critical to you. I think there's probably a couple of phases to this, where one, you want to define what are your security requirements, right? For suppliers, what do you want your suppliers to achieve? Because you talk to them and say you need to be better at security. They say, right, give us a benchmark, right? Tell us what you want us to do. Then there's considering how do you communicate that to your suppliers, right? So obviously the best time to do this is during contract renewal or at the initial stages, so during the procurement process. It becomes more complicated with established suppliers. So you might want to think about signing up to sort of a code of conduct, something like that, a little bit more wishy-washy, but still sort of gets across your intentions. So once you've established your requirements, you can then start monitoring your suppliers, right? And then the other side to that is you want to understand what they're doing in a general sense, right? So this will depend on the criticality, because there's not infinite resources out there, but you would want to understand what are the security governance processes that your supplier has put in place, how are they managing their own information security. So you need to, and to do that, you need to engage with them. You need to start that dialogue.
Okay, so let me break that down then. So we know who they are, we know what they do,
yep.
We've tiered them based on their importance.
Exactly.
From that
yep.
point then, we're going to communicate the security requirements that we've got for them. I suppose based on the categorisation, there might be more significant requirements for important suppliers.
Absolutely.
But for maybe less important suppliers, we might apply a lower level. We might say, you need to be Cyber Essentials Plus or equivalent.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've established those requirements, we've communicated them. What do we do then in terms of understanding what their current security posture looks like? What's the most common way in which organisations would go and talk to their suppliers and say, what's your current security, and demonstrate to me that you meet that standard?
Well, so there's a couple of avenues. I mean, the most common one, and probably the most dreaded and the most complained about, is your security questionnaire. And that will come back to you, and you'll look at that and go, right, well, that's given us comfort, or we're not too comfortable with that. Give us more information. You've said you've certified to this standard, say ISO 27001 or Cyber Essentials or something like that. Show us the certificate.
So an organisation, and
yep.
we've been on both sides of this with different clients, those that have received questionnaires and those that have sent questionnaires out. They send the questionnaire out, they get 10, 15, 20 responses back.
Mm-hmm.
They've then got to make sense of those. They've got to work through them
yep.
and translate that into
yep.
risk that they can then make plans around in terms of how they respond and managing it. So how do organisations address that challenge?
So it's difficult, right? The organisations don't have a limited budget, and their internal teams don't have a limited time, and this takes time, right? To engage with the suppliers, to discuss, to really analyse the risk. One opportunity is to outsource that to a specialist organisation who can provide that gap between, right, okay, we know we've got a supply chain risk. We need to understand what that is. We need help translating it into a format that we can understand and then manage going forward.
Okay, so that's a nice opportunity for us to talk about SupplyIQ, which is our service. We developed a web application called SupplyIQ, which we anticipated being used by organisations as a third-party risk management tool.
Yep.
We're not a software as a service company. We actually are a consultancy business, and in developing it, actually we came to realise it was less about the tool, because we work with lots of organisations that had tools, things like OneTrust, Risk Ledger, things like that, and they're really good tools, but they probably didn't have the expertise all the time to make sense of the responses, to then work out how to respond to them and think about how they would manage the risk associated with it.
Absolutely.
So we developed it as a service. So how does our service work? And if a client was working with us, how would that process work? How would we map onto their organisation to provide that service to implement their programme and manage their supply chain risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and this goes back to why we discovered it was less about a tool, more about that service that sits behind it, because organisations were coming to us and saying, we don't just need a tool, we've got tools. What we don't have is time or the expertise to implement and then manage this and then analyse it and translate it effectively.
So the expertise is around interpreting the feedback. So an organisation comes back to us and they tell us that they don't have MFA on external interfaces, or they don't do annual security training, or the customer environment doesn't have penetration testing, and we then interpret that in the context of the service they're providing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So we'll have you'll have access as part of organisations that use our service have access to subject matter experts in cybersecurity, and cybersecurity is a broad house. So there is. There's a deep bench both technically and from a governance and process perspective, and that expertise allows us to look at organisations within the context of the service they provide, but also within the context of what good cybersecurity practices are, and then and that will tease out information, that will tease out things that might not necessarily be immediately obvious, especially if you're having to go through 20, 30, 40 of these things. A good example would be when if an organisation says that, well, of course we've got MFA, you can access. The only way you can access this critical environment within our infrastructure is from a trusted network. But then it turns out that they've got a VPN on that network that doesn't require an MFA, right? So looking at those in silo, okay, that's a bit of an issue, but that's great. Well, actually, that VPN allows access to a trusted network, and devices on that trusted network might have access to the infrastructure, but by dint of there being no MFA at the very front of that, how can we rely on that trusted network? And it's that sort of...
And that's where the expertise
And that's where the expertise comes in.
Whether it's in a client's organisation already and they've got a tool like OneTrust, or whether it's using a SupplyIQ service.
It's building the context out of the tool, right?
Yeah. It's being able to interpret it. So
it's information versus analysis, right?
So whether it's a SupplyIQ service or whether an organisation is doing it themselves, I think what we're saying there is it's important to analyse the feedback that comes back and then think about it in the context of the services that they provide. A no or a negative response from one supplier might present a relatively insignificant risk, but from another supplier, it might be a really significant risk.
Absolutely.
So having gathered the information and understood the basis or the baseline security that suppliers have got, how does the service then provide value back to the client?
Once that information has been analysed and we've got to the point where we think we've built up what is an accurate picture of your supplier's security practices, we will translate that into actionable recommendations, because throughout this process we've built an understanding of what your risk appetite is, but also how the lack of technical control or lack of process may have a specific impact to your business, the data, or your people. And that's the key thing with it being not just a tool but a service, in that the the feedback is consultant driven based on an understanding of your business.
So at the end of a cycle, we in the service may have identified areas of risk, but we're not just saying, here you go, up to you what you do with them now. We're actually giving them guidance and advice on their options and what other areas of good practice might say, or what good practice might say is the right approach to take, depending on their risk appetite, I guess.
Correct, yes. And, you know, what's good practice, what's reasonable, and what we think you as an organisation, based on, you know, what you want to achieve, should aim for.
So Matt, why don't we finish, and I'll finish with one question. What do you think the future looks like for supply chain security risk management? Get your crystal ball out and tell us what you think most organisations are going to be doing over the next 24, 36 months in that particular field.
So honestly, I think organisations are going to be worrying more and more and more about their supply chain security. What we're seeing over the past, last few years, and going forward, is more and more. Every organisation is part of some form of supply chain, and more through regulatory pressure, insurance pressure, or other pressure, cybersecurity requirements are being pushed down the supply chain, and part of that will be adopting good cybersecurity, not only good internal cybersecurity practice, but also looking further down your supply chain to understand where risks are and mitigating those risks.
Matt, thank you very much. It's been very enlightening. Grateful for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.